Hey, what's up guys? One of the questions which I get asked more often is how do we connect our application to a database? In this video, I'm going to show you just that. We will be building a web application using the Flask framework of Python, which interacts with a MySQL database. Let me quickly show you what our application would look like. It's a pretty simple application. We just have two text fields called name and email, and on entering the details and hitting the submit button, these details get stored onto a MySQL database, and that information is being retrieved and displayed onto the web browser. Let me show you a demo of that. So now on hitting the submit button, the details are being saved onto a MySQL database, and on this page, those details are being fetched from the database and being displayed onto the web browser. As I told you earlier, it's a pretty simple application. The focus is purely on the backend. We will not be using any CSS or JavaScript, just some HTML text. Alright, now let's see how to build this application. As a prerequisite, you need to have Python 3 as well as MySQL installed on your machine. Now, in case you don't have MySQL installed, I'll leave you links in the description below which you can follow to get it installed. Apart from these, we also need a couple of modules of Python which will help us in building this application. Let's install them. I'm executing all of these commands on my Mac OS. Open up the terminal and enter pip3 space install Flask, which is used to run the Flask application. Now pip3 is the package manager for Python 3. Now I have got them installed already on my machine. You should probably seeing another prompt. And the next thing we need to install is the Flask MySQL DB, which lets our Flask application connect to a MySQL database. So that's pip3 install flask-mysql db. Let's now create our project folder. Let me create a folder called Flask App in my desktop, and then let me open the Atom editor on the project folder. Now you could use the Atom editor or any text editor of your choice. Now every Flask application will have the main server file which will handle all the requests that comes into our application. Let's call this file as app.py. Now the first thing that we need to do is to import the Flask module into this application. So that's from Flask, import Flask with an uppercase F. And the next thing that we need to do is to instantiate an object for this Flask class. So let's call the object as app, and to this Flask class we pass in the current module, which is identified by 2 underscores and name. And then what we need to do is to run this application. So if our current module is being run, this name attribute will have the value of 2 underscores and main. So if this is the value that our name attribute has, then we run the application with the command app.run. So now let's save this program and execute our application to see if it works. Let's open a terminal and enter Python 3 space the file name, which is app.py. Now you will see that the application runs on 127.0.0.1, which is the local host of your machine, and the application is being run on 5000 port of the local host. So let's open a web browser and go to localhost port 5000. Now you will see that we have a message that says the requested URL was not found on the server. Now that's because we haven't added any routes to our server yet. So if we say localhost :5000, it says that we are making a request on the root of the server, which is identified by a /. So let's go back to our application and add a new route to handle the case when a request is being made on the root of the server. So we have a decorator called route, which can be called on the app variable. So that's app.route, and the request is now being made on the root of the server, which is a /. Now under this we define a function. Let's call this function as index, and this function will return text which will be displayed onto our web browser. Let's just say we are returning the text called Flask. So now let's save this program and go back to a browser and refresh it to see if it works. Now as you can see, it still doesn't work, and that's because our server is being run. So we need to stop the server by pressing a Ctrl+C and then restart the server. Now this process could be a bit tedious. Every time you make a change, you will have to stop your server and then start it again for that change to be reflected. Now since we don't want to do that every time, to our app.run we add a parameter called debug equal to true. Now this will make sure that any change we make gets updated immediately onto the web browser. So now let's start the server again and see if this change has been reflected. So let's go back to a browser, refresh it, and you see that the text called Flask is being returned. So to make sure that the changes are being updated immediately, let's change the case of this Flask. Let's say we are entering Flask in all uppercase. So now if we save this program, the server gets refreshed, and now if we refresh the browser, we have the text in all uppercase. Now the text which is being returned by our function is in HTML format, which means if we add any HTML tag in this will be reflected on our browser. Let's give that a try. So now if we save this file and go back to our browser and refresh it, we see that the h1 tag has been reflected and the text Flask is now in heading format. Now we don't want to clutter our main application file with all this HTML text. For this purpose, Flask comes with a module called render template. Now render template can be used to render HTML files. So instead of returning HTML text from here, we would place this within a HTML file and then render that file. So let's say return render template, and here we pass an HTML file. Let me call this file as index.html. Now the function render template would look for this file index.html within a folder called templates from the root of our project. So from the root of our project, let's create a folder called templates, and within templates, let's create a file called index.html. Now within this index.html, let's place our HTML text. So that would be h1 tag and Flask. This time I'm changing the case to make sure that it is being rendered from index.html. So now let's save this program and go back to a browser and refresh it to see if it works as expected. So now as you can see, the case of our Flask has been changed, which means this text is now being rendered from index.html file by making use of the render template function. Next thing that we want to do is to add a form within this index.html so that the user can submit his name and email address, which will be stored in the database. So let's create a form in this. So our form will have two fields, the name and the email field. So that's name, input, type will be text. And let's give a name to this text box. Let's call this name. Similarly, let's have another field called email. So the type of this field will be email and the name of this field will be email. And the final field which we will have is a submit button. So that's input type equals submit. So now let's refresh our browser to make sure that this form is being loaded up. Now as you can see, we have two fields, name and email. So if we enter any details into this and hit the submit button, nothing will happen. That's because we haven't handled that case yet. So at this point, we should be creating a database which can store this name and email which is being entered by the user. So now let's log into a MySQL server. Let's open terminal or command prompt, whichever operating system you're in, and enter MySQL space -u and enter your username, which is root in my case, space -p, and hit the enter button. Now here you need to enter the password which you had entered at the time of installation. If you haven't changed the password, the default password would be 1234. Now once you have logged into MySQL server, we need to create a database. Let's create a database called Flask App. Once created, we need to use this database. The command for that is use Flask App. And now we need to create a table in this database. To create a table, use the command create table, the table name, which is users, and then enter the fields of the table, which is name, which will be of a varchar with the size of 20. And another field email, which will be varchar of size 40. So now let's make a query to the database and make sure that this table users is empty. So that's select star, which will output all the rows of the table. So that's select star from the name of the table, which is users. And you can see that it's an empty set, which means no entries has been made into this table yet. Now all of these commands need not be in uppercase. It is just that by convention, all the built-in commands of MySQL is being written in uppercase. Alright, so now let's go back to our application and make our Flask application interact with this database called Flask App. Now when a submit button is being hit from the form, a post request is being made on the server. So first our form needs to identify this as a post method. So within our form tag, let's identify this one as a post method. And since we are not redirecting the form data to any other URL, the action field of the form data will be empty. Now let's go to our main application file, and within this we need to identify this URL accepts a post request as well. So in your route decorator, add this methods as both get as well as post. Now if it is a get request, we display the form to the user, and if it is a post request, we need to store the details onto the database. So how do we identify this request as a get request or a post request? So Flask comes with a module called request. Now by making use of this request, we can check if it was a get request or a post request. So here we want to check if this request is a post request. So if your request.method is equal to post, then this means the submit button was hit from the form, and now we have the form data which needs to be stored onto the database. So the first thing that we need to do is to fetch the form data. Let's store the form data in a variable called user details. The form data can be obtained from request.form. Let's make use of two variables, one to hold the name, which is user details with the key as name, and another one to store the email, which is user details with the key as email. Now this name and email are the names which we had given to our text fields name and email. Now that we have the name and email of the user, we need to connect this application to the database and then store these values in the database. And to do that, let's make use of the Flask MySQL DB module which we had installed earlier in this video. So that's from Flask_MySQL DB import MySQL. Now there are certain parameters which we need to configure to connect the database with this application. Let's just list them down. So the first thing which we need to configure is the host of the MySQL DB. So that's MySQL host. Let's fill these details later. app.config. The next parameter would be the username. The next parameter is the password. And the final parameter is the name of the database. Now these are all sensitive information and we don't want to expose that information as a part of our application. So let's have a separate config file in which we enter all these parameters. Let me call that file as db.yaml. Now let's enter all the parameters here. MySQL host. Now this field will be localhost since we are running this locally. The next parameter is the username of the database, which is root. The next parameter is the password field. Enter the password of your MySQL DB. I'm entering mine. And finally, the database which is being used, which is Flask App, which is the database which we had earlier created. So now let's make use of all of these parameters within our application. So let's import a module called YAML. And then we need to import our file called db.yaml. So let's store all the details in a variable called db and then load the YAML file. So that would be yaml.load, and we need to open the file which is db.yaml. So now we have all the parameters within this variable called db, and all that we got to do is to enter the parameters. So db MySQL host will give you the host of your MySQL, and MySQL user will give you the username. MySQL password will give you the password, and finally MySQL DB will give you the database. Now that all the configuration has been completed, let's instantiate an object for this MySQL module. In order to do that, let's create an object. Let's call it MySQL, all in lowercase, and to the MySQL module we pass this app as the parameter which has all the configuration parameters completed. So that completes the instantiation of MySQL object. Now we can make use of this MySQL object within our post request to make an entry into the database. So within our post request, we need to create a cursor by making use of the MySQL object. So let's create a cursor, and to create a cursor, it's mysql.connection.cursor. Now by making use of this cursor, we can execute queries on our MySQL database. So that would be cursor.execute. Now the query which we want to execute here is to insert the name and email into the table called users. So that's insert into, the name of the table is users, and the fields which we want to insert the values is name and email. And the values which we want to insert are parameterized, and since they are string values, it is identified with a %s. And the names of the fields are name and email. Now this statement will make sure that the name and email is being stored into the database, but we need to add another step, which is to commit these changes to the database. So in order to do that, it is mysql.connection.commit. So this will save the changes within our database. And once that's done, we can close our cursor, that's cursor.close. So once all the operations have been completed, let's return a string. Let's just say success to identify that this operation has been completed successfully. So now let's save our program and go back to our browser and enter name and email to see if it is being reflected onto the database. So let's go back to the browser. Let me just refresh it once. So we have name and email. Let me enter it, febin and febin@gmail.com. Now on hitting submit button, we have a message called success. So let's go back to our database and check if this entry has been made into our database. So that's select star from users. And as you can see, we have the detail which is name febin and email which is febin@gmail.com. Great. So now let's retrieve this value from the database and display it onto our browser. So let's now create a new endpoint. Let me call it app.route/users. So if we go to /users, we need to display all the users who have been registered in the database. And since the only operation which we perform here is to display the list of users, we will not be adding a post method to this URL. So let's create a function. Let's call it users. And all that we need to do here is to fetch the details from the database. So let's once again create a cursor, that's mysql.connection.cursor. And by making use of this cursor, we execute the select command. So that's cursor.execute select star from users. Now this will return a result value. Let's store that in a variable called result value. Now this returns the number of rows. So we need to check if the result value is greater than 0. If it is greater than 0, it means there are some entries in the database. So only if it is greater than 0, we retrieve the values from the database. So that would be your user details equal to your cursor.fetchAll. Now this will return all the rows which have been fetched by the MySQL cursor. And then what we need to do is to display all these details onto the web browser. So let's render a template for that. That's render template. And let's call this file as users.html, and we also need to pass user details as a parameter. We will be making use of Jinja template to iterate through the list and display the list of all the users. So let's create a new template called users.html. Now we will make use of this file to display the name and email addresses of all the users. Let's output that in a table. Now here we make use of Jinja template. We use a for loop of Jinja template to iterate through the list called user details. In each row we output the name and email. So the first data will be the name of the user, which is the first field with the index 0. That's the order which is being returned by the database. And second field with the value 1, which is the second field in the database, which is the email field. And we are enclosing them within double braces to differentiate them from a normal HTML text. And let's now end the for loop. And let's close the table tag. So now let's navigate to /users in our application to see if we obtain the output. So that's localhost 5000/users, and we have the output as febin and febin@gmail.com. So let's make sure that it's working fine by entering another name and email address. This time let me enter Chris and chris@gmail.com. So now on submitting, we have a success message, and when we go to /users, we have the new email address as well. That's great. So now there is one more small change which we can do to this application. Instead of returning success, we could go to this URL directly, which is /users. So Flask has a module called redirect, and we could just say return redirect and the path to your URL, which is /users. So now let's make sure that this works by making a new entry into the database. So that's John and john@gmail.com. And this time on submitting, you see that we directly went to /users and we have all the output on this page. Let's quickly take a review on what's happening in our application. The first thing which we did was to import all the necessary modules to run our application, and then we instantiated an object to run our Flask application. Then by making use of the db.yaml, which is a config file, we loaded all the configuration parameters necessary to connect to the MySQL database, and then we instantiated an object for MySQL. Then on accessing the root of our application, we display a form to the user, which is in index.html. Now this form will collect details such as name and email from the user, and on hitting the submit button, we make a post request to our application. Now in the post request, we fetch the form details and then make a connection to the MySQL database by making use of a cursor. And we use this cursor to insert into the database to the table called users. We enter fields such as name and email which have been fetched from the form. And then we commit on the database and we close the cursor and we redirect to the page /users. Now in /users, we fetch the details from the database and display them onto the web browser. So in order to do that, we once again open a MySQL cursor and then we execute a query to fetch all the rows. Now if the returned rows are more than 0, then we store the details in a variable called user details, and then we render a template called users.html and pass user details as a parameter. So in users.html, we output the name and email addresses of the users in tabular format. For this, we make use of Jinja template, in which we iterate through the list called user details by making use of the for loop of Jinja template. And since the first field which we had used in the table was name and the second field was email, they are indexed with 0 for name and 1 for email. So that's the end of this video. Thank you very much for your time. If you did like this video, do give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comment section below for any questions that you might have, or if you want me to create videos on any other topics, let me know about them as well. This is a part of a bigger course of Flask which I'm building on Udemy. If you have any suggestions for that course, do let me know about them as well. I have made this code available on GitHub. The links can be found on the descriptions below. Do support me by subscribing to my channel. Thank you very much.